We're still not able to get access to the printer, so that means no quiz for the foreseeable future. So, there you go.
Oh.
I know.
Oh,
Hey,
God.
well, there's good news and there's bad news to that. The good news is no quiz today and probably next week and whenever we get back. The bad news is you get them all at once on the day we get back. So, no, I think we hammered chapter 7 pretty well. Who can tell me what the main theme of chapter 7 is? Sorry? Priest? Specifically who? Melchizedek. Who can tell me Melchizedek's name, what it means? He's king of righteousness. What else was he king of?
Salem.
Salem. That is peace. It could even mean possibly king of, I believe it was Jerusalem. So, yeah, very good. Who can tell me the significance, I guess the argument for why Melchizedek is a greater order of priesthood than Levi? It's the interaction between Abraham and Melchizedek.
Paid tithes.
Yes, so Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, and because we are in the patriarchal age at that point, the patriarch represents the sum of the whole family lineage, and so through that argument, since Levi is still in the loins of his ancestor, in a way Levi paid tithes as well to Melchizedek. So that's kind of the argument there. Yeah, so there's, who can tell me the 3 books that Melchizedek is mentioned in?
Genesis.
That's right, very good. So besides that, there's not a lot to glean from Melchizedek as far as major importance. That kind of sums up the gist of it. Moving on to chapter 8. Chapter 8 is going to look at Jesus really having a better covenant than the old. So there's going to be 3 arguments that we're going to look at in this chapter. The preacher refers to the old covenant as the first covenant and not the old covenant. We call it the old covenant, but typically it's referred to as the first. The preacher does not speak critically of the Old Testament or Judaism in general. He continues that trend here. Chapters 5 through 7 generally deal with the person of the great high priest. Chapters 8 through 10 is going to focus more on the ministry and the service of the great high priest. And so chapter 8 starts with, now the main point in what we are saying is this. And so this is the sum, the chief point, the main conclusion of the previous chapters that have been dealing with Jesus as our great high priest. So the comments started way back in chapter 5, if you recall. And so this is going to be the sum total of the thought process from way back then. And it's going to be wrapped up over the next couple chapters. So who can tell me what a covenant is? We touched a little bit on this last week, I believe.
It's kind of an agreement between 2 parties, usually.
It is. Does anyone remember in the Old Testament kind of what that covenant looks like between the parties?
It was a blood covenant. Well, one of them was.
Yeah. Is covenants in today's society, is it between 2 equal parties usually? Typically, yeah, 2 equal parties. Between God and man, is that the case? No. Basically, it's God lays down the ground rules, and man can either accept or deny, and that's all there is to it. And so the first covenant what was the purpose of the first covenant? We've talked about this as well. It did have a function. Yeah, well, I think order is definitely one component of it, absolutely. I can hear there's talking at the Harvey table, so. Well, what else we got?
I thought you were talking to him.
I don't think I saw your dad smooth it on.
No.
Eric's legs were moving, so he's wanting to talk.
Oh, his legs were moving.
Yeah, he's like,
Can you repeat the question?
What was the purpose of the first covenant?
That it was done.
I don't think so.
That it happened.
It did happen, that's not the purpose.
To establish a relationship between God and man?
Exactly, so that's definitely a big component. If Jesus was just born into native, let's say a Native American tribe, just out of the blue, or Scandinavian people, or somewhere in Africa, and there was no one looking for the Messiah, what good would that have done humanity? So part of it was preparing the world for the coming of the Messiah. Another component was to bring remembrance of sin to people. That was another major component of the first law. To have order as well, to have societal law, you have to have that. So that's another component. So now, with that being said, why was the first covenant imperfect? Or if imperfect maybe isn't the best word, but incomplete.
it couldn't. Yeah.
Yeah, no one could obey it except for one man. Who's that?
And it couldn't forgive sins either.
Right. It couldn't. So Jesus was the fulfillment of the first covenant. So now that we've kind of touched on that, the three arguments of Christ's covenant being better are the new covenant is ministered by a better high priest, which we've discussed the evidence of that in 7. Jesus ministers in a better place. Number 3, Jesus' covenant is founded upon better promises. So, 3 reasons for the new covenant being ministered by a better high priest. Well, Jesus' moral adequacy. When we look at verse 1 in chapter 8, it says we have such a high priest. And so we needed a priest who was separated from sinners and was spotless and blameless. Number 2, Jesus finished the work. And so Jesus is seated at the right hand of God. The NASB says has taken his seat. So what is the significance of someone sitting down in regards to the role of the priesthood?
Well, the work is completed.
The work is
It's done.
completed.
Yeah, it's done.
Were there any seats in the tabernacle or temple for the priest to sit? Why is that?
Ongoing work.
The work is never over. And so Jesus has sat down in heaven at the right hand of God. Now, what is the significance of the right hand? That is a position of power. So not only is the work finished, he is seated at a position of kingship and absolute authority and power. So that's significance. Again, the law of Moses brought up remembrance, but there was no remission of sins. Now, moving on, we've talked about that. It says, only a priest after the order of Melchizedek could be enthroned, because Melchizedek was both king and priest. And so a high priest could never sit down in the temple, as we talked about, because there were no seats. The work was never done. And someone from Levi, could they act as king?
No.
No. Their role was only to be in the role of priesthood. Okay, so that kind of covers the first introductory material. Let's go ahead and read chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. So now the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty of heaven, a minister in the holy places in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now if he was on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things, but when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." And so here we start to get into Jesus ministers in a better sanctuary. So I like this comment from Lightfoot. Christ is the real priest and the only real place where sin can be dealt with. That's in heaven and the presence of God. So this heavenly ministry will be further touched upon in chapter 9, but we're going to start to look at it here. Now, there are different sanctuaries noted in the Bible, and all of these God erected or pitched, if you use the King James Version. So this was God's idea or God's arrangement. The first was the tabernacle, which Moses was instructed to erect. Then we have the Temple of Solomon. Then we have the Temple of Herod. Then we have the church. And then we have heaven, or the true tabernacle which the Lord has set up. So what is or was the significance of each one of these tents, if you will?
A shadow.
Okay, so they are all a shadow or a pattern of what true things? What are they shadows of?
The true tabernacle.
Okay, so that would be
Place where God dwells.
the place where God dwells. That's heaven. Yeah. So, anything else? Why they're important?
I have a question with verse 4.
Okay.
Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. Now, in looking at that sentence, the he that's being referred to is Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around, all right, he wouldn't be a priest at all. Well, I need some explanation.
Because he wasn't from the right tribe to start with.
Okay, he's from
Levi.
Judah. Right.
Yeah. Remember, Judaism is still being practiced right now at the time of this recording. So, you know, if he was on earth, he wouldn't be a priest, since there are priests who here on earth are continually offering gifts according to the law. But as we'll see, although Christ died on earth, where was his sacrifice made? It was made in heaven. Really, that is where sin was dealt with. His sacrifice was made to God for remissions of sin. So his priesthood is in heaven. It's not on earth.
Well, it says, right before that, it says, thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer.
Right.
Well, Christ offered himself.
Right.
But then, the other, as I'm trying to break this thing down, this priest, is he talking about Jesus, or is he talking about the high priest?
I believe he's talking about Christ, but again, I believe the idea here is that although Christ did die on the earth, his gifts, which he gave himself, the remission of sins, that took place in heaven, that were his priestly duties were enacted.
So that was the fulfillment of the blood covenant that Abraham and God came up with.
Yes.
What is it, the path of blood, or what is that? What do they call that? Yeah, when Abraham was told to split the animals, and they walked through the blood.
God walked through.
God walked through the
Got
blood,
on his own.
and he held Abram back, and he walked through it again. And that's the fulfillment of that covenant. Because Abraham knew that his people couldn't do it. He knew exactly his people couldn't do it. And to walk through that blood meant that you're going to die that way, or you're going to die because of you violated that covenant. So God took care of it. And I think Christ's death was a fulfillment of that covenant.
Yeah.
Sure.
I don't know if that, does that make sense?
To me
What
it
I'm trying-
does, yeah.
Okay. Does anybody else have questions about that, or does that, are we all good with that? The only place that sin could be, who's the only person who can deal with sin? And
Christ.
Christ, okay? So, God. And so, because there was a Levitical priesthood established on earth, if Christ's ministry was on earth, that would contradict that you can't have two priesthood and two covenants going at the same time. So Christ's priesthood is better because it's spiritual. It's in heaven. It's not. It doesn't pertain to really matters of the sacrificial system of the old law with bulls and goats. He offered his gift once because that was sufficient. So hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, that's definitely a little bit of a tougher verse there to kind of wrap your head around. So
Would that gift have been necessary according to the law? Christ's gift?
so according
the
to
priests
the
offered gifts,
yes,
but
that yes.
Christ's
So
covenant was totally,
yeah, so one of the roles of a priest is to offer gifts or sacrifices
Right.
for remission of sins, or in the Levitical sense, remembrance. And so that's the role of a priest. That's one of the duties. So Christ was also expected to give a gift or a sacrifice for sins. And so that's just one of the fundamental duties of a priest.
But the Levitical priests didn't really forgive the sins, right?
No.
They just moved them forward another year till they did this again.
It really just brought remembrance of that year's
Yeah.
sin, yeah, and brought recognition to the people of their sinful state. So, yeah,
But Christ's, excuse me, Christ's gift was himself as the sacrificial lamb. He
Right.
was the sacrifice. There was no priest that offered Christ. Christ offered
Right.
himself. So I think that helps kind of explain the fact that this was his death was the fulfillment of the Old Testament.
right,
It fulfilled all the predictions, the prophecies, the promise that God had made. And with that, and I think we'll get into that, I don't remember if it's later on in 8 or in 9 about the Testament,
yeah,
the last will and testament. But I think that helps shed a little bit more light on the fact that
right,
he wasn't a priest until after his sacrifice, because he was also king. People didn't accept him as king, but
yeah.
he was king.
Maybe it would be helpful, I know it's skipping ahead, but why don't we look at Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 and following. I don't know, we'll just read down for a little ways, because I think chapter 10 chapter 10 is the summation of the priesthood, because chapter 11 gets into the heroes of faith, and so the finishing thoughts are going to be in chapter 10. So why don't we read that, and that might kind of help wrap things up a little bit, because it'll be a couple weeks before we get here, but this might be beneficial now. So chapter 10, verses 1 and following. For since the law has but a shadow of good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins? But in these sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. And burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. Now when he says above, you have neither desired or taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings, these are offered according to the law. Then he added, Behold, I have come to do your will. He does away with the first in order to establish the second. And by that will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. Now every high priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. So I feel like that is a really good summation of what we're starting to look at in chapter 8.
So then that's where the change of the priesthood happened.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because the priest offered sacrifice, Jesus offered himself
Mm-hmm.
as the sacrifice, making him what he considered, we know he's considered a high priest. Would he also be considered the priest? The priest and high priest and king?
I'm not sure.
Was the priest different from the high priest?
Well, Jesus
yeah,
was,
there were-
he was, the priest serves.
Right.
The high priest.
The high priest
Serves. as well.
serves and goes into the Holy of Holies. Well, Jesus, he served, didn't he?
Yes.
But then he also went into the Holy of Holies with his
With
sacrifice.
his sacrifice.
So now, if he serves as he priest and then high priest,
He is the high priest.
the high priest, yeah. So, and that's the change of the covenant. Because you had a change in priesthood.
It says there in 10 verse 9, it says, Behold, I have come to do your will.
Yeah.
I kind of always took that as your bidding, but it says he does away with the first order to establish the second. So I don't think it's wrong to think of almost literally this is filling out like a will and testimony of when someone dies.
Yeah.
And so Jesus came to enact the second will, if
It
you
says
will.
until the testator dies, the will is no effect.
Yeah,
Right.
so he did die,
Yes,
and this is when it happens.
yes,
So now we have a different priesthood.
yes.
Yes.
However, back in verse 8 and 1 and 4, Judaism is still very much being practiced right now,
Yeah.
even though the second will has taken place. And I think that there's going to be me personally, I think that there's probably a grace period from God while there is this transition. But the destruction of Jerusalem is going to end the practice of Judaism as it's supposed to be practiced. So there's not going to be the ability to even practice these things in just a few short years of this being written. So Yeah, does chapter 10, did that kind of help with dissecting 8? Because that truly is the summation of the next couple chapters. Okay, I gotta get back.
Historically, Christianity, or those of the way,
Mm-hmm.
were thought to be an offshoot of Judaism
Yeah,
until the destruction of Jerusalem.
yeah,
Until the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. And then it survived,
mm-hmm,
but Judaism kind of took a back seat.
right. Yeah, I think I told you guys this one time. I think I got this from Josh, my buddy Josh, but I think he said a third of Jews are agnostic. They don't believe in God at all. A third try to practice Judaism to no avail, and then the other third have disbanded into other religious beliefs. And so that's a pretty sad sentiment to think about. Without, being able to practice Judaism, a third of the people have abandoned God completely, and then most have gone into other religious beliefs or kind of assimilated because they don't want to accept Christ either. Jews today, they, from what I understand, over in the Middle East, they do not want to talk about it. They do not want to recognize Christ as the Messiah. They're still expecting a Messiah. So that's I don't understand it. I don't get it, but that's where they're at. Okay, so getting back into the text here. So talking about gifts and sacrifices. So all priests have to offer something, and as we mentioned, Jesus offered himself. Specifically here, it's referring to the Day of Atonement. It is the chief function of priests to make offering for sin. Since Jesus is the great high priest, the writer reasons that he must have something to offer as well. He does not define the offering now, although he has already referred to it in chapter 7, and he will explain it more in detail later, and that's from Life. So note the word in the beginning of 8 here, the necessary. It is necessary for a priest to have something to offer. It is one of the fundamental duties of the high priest and the priests that practice in general to give sacrifices and gifts to God. Now, Jesus serves as high priest in heaven because the order of Melchizedek governs the ministry and not the order of Levi, which is earthly. He would not be a high priest on earth. The order of Melchizedek governs the ministry, not the order of Levi. And so, from the standpoint of eternity, Christ died on earth, but his offering was made in heaven before God. And so, consider that God's will could not be ignored even by God's only begotten Son. So, God's will would be fulfilled. And so I think that's a significant statement there from Light to kind of grasp that although Christ did die on earth, the offering was made before God in heaven, where his priesthood would be. So that is why Christ's ministry is in a better sanctuary.
Question or
Yes.
statement. What was the sole duty of the high priest? And when he went into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, what was his purpose? And why did he do it? Just want to go in there and dust off the emblems? So he went in there to not only offer sacrifices for himself and to sprinkle the blood, but also for the people.
Right.
So Christ's sacrifice as the high priest did it once and for all mankind. That's how he becomes the high priest. he didn't have to offer sacrifices for sins because he had no sin. That's what makes him the perfect high priest. And when it mentions the Day of Atonement, that's Passover, is that correct? Is that Passover?
I don't think so.
When is that? When was that?
Not the Day of Atonement. I don't remember exactly when. Day of Atonement was sometime, would be in our fall calendar, I think.
Yom Kippur? Let's see, they did it. He did it, okay? He just did it. And
Agreed.
so, I mean, to understand, we're getting into the simple stuff, and now we're getting into the deep stuff. And to have a better understanding of Jesus's actions, we can see how he becomes the better high priest
Right.
because of that. Sinless,
Yep.
the Lamb of God.
Yep.
Even the symbolism of that his whole passion, coupled with the Exodus, really ties things in too. I mean, you put that in front, and then at the end, on the backside, you see, whoa, this has totally changed everything.
Yeah. 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 Definitely some good stuff to dig into. Let's talk about next the old law being type or pattern. So the Greek word tupos, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but it gives us the English word type or pattern. So Moses did things by a pattern, and who showed him the pattern?
God did.
God did. Okay, good. So it was according to God's will. The temple was patterned after the tabernacle. At least that's what's implied. Moses offered as an example of God's requiring everything be done according to a pattern or a blueprint, including the ministry of Jesus and the work of the church. And so the priests who were serving in the temple at that time were ministering in a sanctuary that was only a copy, that is a shadow of the heavenly sanctuary. So as we've mentioned, Christ sits, the Levites stand. Christ ministers in heaven in the true tent. The Levites were only serving a copy or a shadow on earth. So the tabernacle and the temple were not destined to last forever because they were only shadows of true things. Now, Jesus and his church were going to represent the true things, but that's not to say that it's the final I guess the final age, if you will, because eventually it'll all be together in heaven at the end. So the blueprint is, of course, where God dwells, and so the church and Jesus, I guess, I don't know what's the best way to say that. I mean, they do kind of mirror it, but they're definitely more true than the Old Testament law, and I would say
we know it's a perfect law.
yeah.
It was better than the first. It brings us closer to a relationship with God because
Right.
of the forgiveness of sins, not the rolling forward. So that allows us to draw closer to God. Because the whole purpose of his sacrifice was to bring man back from a lost world, from sin.
Right.
To bring that relationship, to restore that relationship.
Mhm.
And in order to restore that relationship, something had to happen. And somebody or something had to die. So, if Jesus came and died for the sin of Adam, right after Adam sinned, what good would that have done? You wouldn't have all this foreshadowing. You wouldn't have had preparation. You wouldn't have had the understanding of what God demands. So you lose all that. So when Jesus came, when did he come?
The right time.
At the right time.
Yeah.
Yeah, at just the right time.
But the church won't cease to be the church at the end either, so, I mean, we will still be
The church, well, is the
the
bride.
the promise of Abraham. So, even though we will be acclimated to be in the place where God dwells, some good things to think about there. Okay, well, let's try to at least touch on the next section here, verses 6 through 13. Excuse me. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them when he says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put the laws into their minds, and I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful towards their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. And speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away." So, who were the mediators of the first covenant?
The priest and the high priest.
Yes, but in regards to giving the law,
Oh,
The prophets.
prophets, angels. There's one fellow in particular that was very,
Moses.
yes, Moses. Who is the mediator of the new covenant?
Christ.
Yes, Christ. So, mediator conveys the idea of an arbitrator, or one who stands in the middle between, on neutral ground between two parties. Jesus as a mediator is better than all of those mentioned from the Old Testament, and that he possesses a better ministry, he mediates a better covenant, and he has guarantees with better promises. But why does man need a mediator?
Because of sin.
God can't even look at sin, so how's he supposed to understand our thoughts, how can he, you gotta have somebody that's been here. Jesus has been here, he knows our emotions, what makes us tick, what makes us do what we do.
Right,
God can't even look at sin, so
yeah.
that's why he's the perfect mediator.
But Jesus understands the God component too.
Yes,
And so
yes.
he is perfectly acclimated to be
And
our
the priest on earth,
little one.
they have sins too,
Right,
Jesus don't.
right. Yep, very good. Could we reconcile our sins by ourselves?
No.
No.
We kind of messed up
there's nothing we could do.
Good answer.
Yeah, so I think that is a good stopping place. We'll talk a little bit more about it next week, and then we will probably get into starting at least chapter 9 next week as well. So until there's, I have access to the printers. I don't have note cards for you, but that's okay. We'll try to review as we go along.
I think it's also interesting, this is a direct message from Jeremiah.
Yes. Yes.
This passage here in chapter 8, is
So-
the exact words, when you look back.
It's
at
quoted.
that
Yep. Now, when did Jeremiah write these words? Do you know that?
Many, many years ago.
Right, but what event? Right before a big event, he wrote these words, Jeremiah did.
Exile.
Right before the Babylonian capture.
Yes.
And so whoever's writing Hebrews is writing this on the eve of of the ransack of
Yeah.
Jerusalem, the end of Judaism. And so there's a parallel there that is very uncanny, that only God could piece together. So we'll look at that a little bit more next week, but yeah.
Yeah, Larry's going through that.